Hello, no wasting time here, straight to the topic. So back in February 2023 I made my own WW1 tier list video, but no one paid attention to it, considering it was 45 minutes long, and no one would watch such a long YouTube video for such a small YouTube channel, and that the script was 7,700 plus words, with 22 pages filled in. I also didn't know about audio rhythm, I just read the script word by word as the video went on, like this.
The first Battle of the Isonzo was a minimal advance for the Italians. The second one was more tactical and victorious for the Italians.
God, I sounded like an NPC. So let's just hope this video reaches the limit of 20 to 30 minutes that I want. And I've also put some jokes in it this time, not that serious. But there's two things I need to do to get this video to the 20 to 30 minute limit. Number one, to the countries that were quickly annexed, I'm only going to say the basic information just to go past. And the second one thing I need to do is not talk so much, just like right now. Basically, the bigger contribution a specific country has, the longer the pages I'm going to write for that specific country. But I'm not going to do the order of which country joined the war. Now, surfing into the tier maker, I tried to find a WW2 tier list, but it didn't really have the countries that I particularly wanted, so I decided to make one myself. Now, you can log in with Google as well, so that's a good thing for me, because before you could only log in with Twitter. So, considering I don't have Twitter, and I can't even be bothered to make one. So, enough jibber jabber, enough messing around, let's get started to the WW2 tier list. First off, the lists. So, we have superb, very good, alright, performed moderately, absolute catastrophe, and so good no one even dared to attack them. A perfect discrimination of the countries who did fuck all. In this list, the countries are as follows. All of the North and South American continent, with the exception of the US and Canada of course. In Asia, Mongolia, Nepal, and Saudi Arabia. And in Europe, Sweden, Switzerland, and Turkey. Sweden just got away with getting invaded by Germany, and then started helping Finland afterwards with a couple soldiers. Germany was actually planning an invasion of Switzerland, but Switzerland had their neutrality 11 out of 10. And Turkey, well, after Ataturk's death, they decided to defend the country once and for all. Fight for their hero, who established the Turkish Republic. With a bit of a twist. They'd only attack if they got attacked first. So, you get where this is going. But anyways, enough bullshitting. Let's get into the actual first country in World War II. Poland. Let's start with the first country that was invaded in World War II. Poland. Well, I mean, there's still China that was invaded earlier in 1937, but hey, it doesn't count. On September 1st, 1939, Germany launched its invasion on Poland. After the Battle of the Borders had begun, Poland was attacked and raided from all sides. Even Slovakia began to make some gains against them, alongside the Germans. Poland had also signed a common defense pact with Britain. How did Britain respond? By not helping them at all. Talk about British allying manipulation, fucking hell. As things couldn't get any worse, the Soviets also started invading. The Polish army tried to reorganize themselves to the borders of Romania, but it was too late. The Germans won the Battle of Kotsk, and eventually the Poles surrendered due to the lack of ammunition. As we may all laugh at them and make memes about them, they did try their best to defend, but the defense lines wasn't so successful. So I guess they get into performed moderately. China. For the record, I'm only going to include post-war battles between China and Japan, because theoretically, World War II started the day Germany invaded Poland. In 1939, China won back-to-back victories in Changsha and Guangxi, with the CCP also helping. They later launched the Winter Offensive, which was a failure. Very limited advance for the Chinese. The CCP did a bit of job though, succeeding in the 100 Regiments Offensive. After 1940, however, things came to a halt. In 1941, China and Vietnam had to witness their eastern coasts ruled over by Japan. In 1942, the Allies, mostly the US, came to help China, though they couldn't see eye to eye because Joseph Stilwell insisted on an aggressive strategy, whilst Madame Shang wanted a patient and less aggressive strategy to break the Japanese blockade. This raised a few eyebrows and a few doubts over the Allies, as they were questioning if China had actually had a clue about good strategies and offensives. But in spite of that, the Chinese did advance into northern Burma in late 1943. Nothing else happened after that, so we've reached the conclusion, folks. China sacrificed itself too much. It had limited advances throughout the war, ignored certain strategies for the Americans, and let Japan do horrific massacres to their people. You gotta say they're lucky that they're just placed in performed moderately. Because if I had also counted the periods of 1937 and 1938, they would have been demoted to absolute catastrophe. Denmark. This is another country that Germany ate for breakfast. I want you to have a guess how long this country lasted until they surrendered. What do you think? A year? A month? A week? A day? 6 hours. 6 hours! Bottom of absolute catastrophe. But hey, I know they weren't ready for war. They didn't want to be involved in the war. But bloody hell, 6 fucking hours! Norway. Now, I know most of you will probably expect Norway to be ranked low in this tier list. However, you're in for a treat. Before the German declaration of war, Norway was relaying Swedish iron ore to Germany, and Great Britain did not like that, and so they mined the waters off the Norwegian coast and bombed the German Altmark ship. The Germans knew what the British were doing, and so they launched Operation Visayubung. On April 9th, 1940, the Norwegians sank the German cruiser Blücher, delaying the German invasion. The Norwegians saved the royal family by winning the Battle of Midskogen. The royal family evacuated from the country guardedly. The Norwegians went all out against the Germans in both Narvik battles, and it was at this point that the UK arrived with their ships, just as the Germans ran out of fuel and ammunition. Fantastic! However, those Norwegian victories were short-lived. In eastern Norway, they just couldn't cope with the German attacks, while in southern Norway, they just capitulated. In western Norway, despite the best efforts from the 4th and 5th Division, the Germans bombed plenty of cities and the Norwegian army disbanded in Florø on May 18th, 1940. The same thing happened in central Norway with the Germans raiding all over the place. Finally, in northern Norway, the Luftwaffe once again bombed Norwegian cities, and with that, the Allied troops withdrew, and the key ports of Norway, together with the country, fell in German hands. To finish off their performance, they had a good go at liberating Finnmark. Overall, do we look at Norway's performance with rose-tinted glasses, or do we genuinely think they did a good job at delaying the German attacks? From my point of view, yes, and therefore I'll be placing them in alright. They just scrape in though. Picture Paul McCoy holding Amy Lee to her death. That's Norway in the alright here. Belgium. I'm gonna be honest with you. Belgium in this war was hopeless. It had over 1,000 artillery, 10 AMC-35 tanks, and loads of combat vehicles and machine guns. But still, even with that, they stood no chance against the Luftwaffe. Only one win for the Allies came against the Germans, and it was the first tank battle of the war, the Battle of Anut. The remaining battles were won by Germany. It didn't take long for Belgium and the Allies to retreat to the coast. In the latter stages of Belgium being annexed, Winston Churchill recommended the Belgian army to withdraw from the Yser line and that the British and French First Army would attack at Bapaume and Cambrai, with the Belgian cavalry on the right of the British. Belgium refused. Such a move would have abandoned Passchendaele, plus the Belgian cavalry could not withdraw from the Yser line, as there was little chance of the Belgian cavalry joining the attacks. The rest is history. Belgium unconditionally surrendered. They certainly didn't live up to their name as they did in World War I. At least abandoning the Ardennes wasn't their idea, it was France's, which I'll touch upon later, don't worry. But let's get back on topic here. It was an absolute catastrophe from Belgium. I honestly can't hide my disappointment. I'm pretty sure Belgium can't hide theirs. But hey, at least they're ahead of Denmark, so that's something. Netherlands. On May 10th, 1940, Netherlands was invaded by Germany. The Dutch people may have been awakened by the German aircraft, but the Dutch army was ready for battle. The Dutch did win the Battle of Houge, launching a counter-offensive just as the German troops landed in the Netherlands. Furthermore, the Dutch won 13 battles against the German aircraft by May 14, 1940. But they would never win another battle against the Nazis again. The Germans bombed Rotterdam and were threatened to bomb other key cities if the Netherlands didn't surrender. Soon enough, they surrendered on May 17th. In other words, within a week. But hey, you know what? They deserve some good credit for the resistance against the Germans. And just like almost every other country in the war, they tried their luck at resisting during their occupation. They even had a good go at the Battle of Groningen, but it was mostly down to Canadian help, which facilitated their liberation. I'll put them in performed moderately, ahead of China and Poland, because at least they showed some balls unlike these two. Luxembourg. Well, what can I say about Luxembourg? There wasn't anything they could do. The 1st, 2nd and 10th Panzer Divisions started invading them and it only lasted a day. Absolute catastrophe, without a doubt. But at least Luxembourg got an Xbox achievement unlocker. It lasted longer than Denmark. France. Oh boy, this is an anticlimax. Whatever, let's do the research on this vast disappointment. France declared war on Nazi Germany on September 3rd, 1939. 2 days after Germany launched its invasion on Poland. After the Poles asked for Allied help, the French launched the Saar offensive, which went nowhere. Later on, France took part in the protection of Norway, but didn't send enough reinforced to them. Next up, they intervened in Belgium, winning the Battle of Hanut, and then in Luxembourg. The next participation for the French is a true embarrassment. The fall of France. Rewind a few years back and the French built the Maginot Line. It was meant to prevent the German attacks, defend Alsace-Lorraine, and to be used as a basis for a counter-offensive. However, the French couldn't be bothered to extend it all the way to the Channel, which would soon turn into a costly mistake. When the Germans invaded Benelux, to avoid facing the Maginot Line, the French left the Ardennes. This gave enough opportunity to surround France's best armies. Then, they breezed through, taking Paris and splitting France into two. Why did they fall so quickly, I hear you ask? Because when I said they took out France's best armies, they literally took out France's best armies. The French spent loads of money to get the Maginot Line done and made it to perfection, that they put all their best armies that served for them and let the peasants do the rest. And then you wonder why it only took Nazi Germany 9 days to get to Paris. Before they surrendered though, they did be back in an Italian invasion, but Italy's performance in World War II was just as hopeless as theirs. Also, fun fact, France fought against itself. Yes, soon after France surrendered, Hitler established Vichy France, which controlled all of Africa. Soon enough, French West Africa established Free France as an act of resistance against the Germans. So, technically, France fought against itself. Anyway, France did nothing at all in World War II. They humiliated themselves with the Maginot Line, which makes enough of an excuse to place them in absolute catastrophe. French Indochina. Aside from France itself, French Indochina was also involved in this war, under Vichy France's time. Tell you what though, when you're invaded by the Japanese with also the help of Thailand, with your new colony owner underperforming, the chances of holding back or even winning the campaign are pretty low. On the other hand, the chances of crumbling and getting annexed are pretty high, and that's what happened, getting occupied by Japan in 4 days. They obviously get into absolute catastrophe for their poor performance. Thailand. Thailand joined forces with Japan after they were coerced by the Japanese, which led to a 5-day invasion of Thailand. After that though, Thailand's performances transformed. They came out victorious in the invasion of French Indochina, along with Japan, and then expanded its borders by gaining Chinese land. Soon after this, however, the Allies launched bombings in Bangkok in June 1944, and then the partisans sabotaged and threw away Plaque Pibun's leadership. They got away by returning all the annexed territories in Burma, China, French Indochina, and British Malaya, and received little or no harsh treaty by the Allies. They actually did alright, even if they were pressured by Japan despite declaring neutrality, but they get into alright nonetheless. Dutch East Indies, nowadays known as Indonesia, Dutch East Indies was one of a hopeless kind. There's nothing to brag about. Those guys got invaded by the Japanese faster than making Nazi Rowan. The Dutch unfortunately couldn't help them as much because they were dealing with the fatherland. At least it lasted longer in the game, 3 months to be precise, but they still go in absolute catastrophe. Iran. Iran lasted only 6 days. Those Czech weapons did not stop them from getting sandwiched by 2 global superpowers. No matter how many tanks they had, they still got their ass kicked. Or bombed. The Soviets bombed Tabrizu, Ardabilu, and Rishet. Yeah, I know. All of you Persian and Arab viewers will be amazed by my sick pronunciation. But back on topic here. Deep down, the Iranians knew that they couldn't fight 2 major superpowers at once, and for that, they also get into absolute catastrophe. Iraq. Iraq initially declared neutrality and had actually signed a treaty in 1930 with the Brits. But on April 1st, 1941, Rashid Ali triggered a coup and then later took control of the country. On May 2nd, the RAF started airstriking in Basra, and on May 3rd, more attacks on Baghdad, Rashid, and Al-Mosul. On May 6th, the Iraqis decided to get out of Al-Habaniya's clutches, and soon after, their reinforcements were attacked. Soon after, the Axis, who had previously assisted them in the coup, would help them in this war too. The Iraqis gave a go at a counterattack, and with the help of Italian tanks, they made 0 progress. The British forces pushed into Baghdad, and with that, Iraq fell into pieces. Not even the Axis could save them. I'm putting them in absolute catastrophe, but ahead of everyone else. Fascist Italy. Shit Austria-Hungary, you're just a shit Austria-Hungary. Okay. Has there ever been a more laughing stock in a major war than Fascist Italy? I don't think so. Let's start from the beginning. When France was on the brink of collapse, the Italians launched an invasion. They advanced so little, Jesus Christ! Germany niced them too much in the armistice. Oh wait, the Italians chose the occupied zones on their own? Even worse! Well, I mean, the Italian invasion of Egypt was successful, but in the North African campaign they were so hopeless it needed the Germans to save their asses. After a successful invasion of British Somaliland, they then attempted to invade Greece, which... part of Italy at its finest. They were as good as the Ferrari SF1000. What was Mussolini up to, honestly? Did he honestly think he's some kind of big deal or something? Pfft, yeah, I can see it very well, mate. Later on, Mussolini came crying to Hitler for help, despite the Austrian had previously told him that an invasion on Greece was not worth it, and he was also planning his invasion on the Soviet Union at that time. Hitler eventually had to pause his invading plans on the Soviets and got other countries to join the Axis powers. Italy took care of Yugoslavia, alongside all the other Axis powers. Then it was Greece's time to fall. Despite the German assistance, the Italians and Germans were squeezed out of Africa. To embarrass them even further, they couldn't even conquer Malta, which was part of the Mediterranean theatre, which, once again, Italy performed pitifully. Not long before the Allies landed at Sicily, the Italian people decided that they didn't want to be involved in the war, and so the country split into two, just like France, and that was the Italian Social Republic versus the Italian Resistance Movement. After a couple bombings, Italy became a republic again. But do you think anyone's impressed with their performance? Well, if you're only reviewing awful country performances, then yes, take a look at Italy's performance in World War II. Seriously though, I never knew Italy performed this bad in World War II. The only, and I mean only, good performances I've seen from Italy in this war are the invasion of Egypt and the occupation of British Somaliland. That's it. Absolute catastrophe, but still ahead of France. Forza Italia! Bulgaria. Some people say that Bulgaria didn't do anything in World War II. Well, what about this? Or this? Or this? Look, I know they didn't want to be in this war and didn't really want to invade Yugoslavia or Greece, but they did a very good occupation to save Germany some reasonable time for the attacks on the Soviets. In autumn of 1944, they launched an offensive in Yugoslavia, and Greece had a friendly war against them right after their liberation. They had also occupied all of Macedonia, both the Yugoslav and Greek parts. A few years back, with Romania, they had signed the Treaty of Craiova, but I don't think that's relevant to the topic I'm canvassing. After the Allied bombing on Sofia, and with the Soviets entering their border, they overthrew the government and replaced it with the Fatherland Front. In other words, communist! Some Axis Bulgarian troops gave a go at Ukraine and Vienna to help out the Germans from not collapsing, but it failed eventually. I guess Bulgaria did well-ish? They going to perform moderately, ahead of everyone else, despite having the most peculiar campaign out of any other country in this tier list. New Zealand, the first member of the Commonwealth to touch upon. New Zealand. The first participation for the Kiwis was in the Battle of Greece, which went okay to be honest, though the second division was dealing with the Axis in Egypt. Then, when Athens fell, the New Zealanders took part in the Battle of Crete, with the second division at Maleme, but eventually it came to German hands. In North Africa they took part in the siege of Tobruk, which was successful. Britain and its Commonwealth took part in the first Battle of El Alamein. Needless to say, New Zealand was involved as well. They also gave support in the invasion of Italy, and in the Pacific won strategically at the Treasury Islands and Green Island. Though, they would obviously struggle in the naval battles against Japan, losing the Battle of Kolombangara. What the fuck is that name? But with the help of the BPF and the RAF, New Zealand kept their cool. They get into alright for not being a Manus. Manus means idiot, in case you couldn't tell. South Africa. South Africa performed well. They defeated the Italian forces in the East African campaign and played a role in the liberation of Madagascar. The Penguins definitely smiled and waved at them. Okay, that was pretty cringe. They also got involved in the North African campaign, particularly in the Second Battle of El Alamein. They did have their fair share of loss, however, losing the Battle of Gazala, and then the 2nd Infantry Division was forced to retreat. They did make an appearance in Italy, defeating the Italian citizens with their vuvuzelas. Wait, let me do a research on this damn instrument. Is the origin of the vuvuzela from South Africa? It is. Okay. Did it exist before the 1940s? Well, my point still stands. But leave the Vuvuzela aside. I gotta finish this tier list, babe. I'm talking on my own, aren't I? The South African Air Force, shortly known as the SAAF, would battle in the sky in Italian Sicily, while together with the Western American pigs, they bombed the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești. I take back for what I said about the US. I might get cancelled. Please forgive me, Americans. Well, the number of total Americans who watch this video are exactly 0, so I might get away with it. Back on topic now, and the South Africans supported the Warsaw Uprising, along with the Soviets winning the Eastern Front. Good thing they didn't turn communist after rooting for them. Ha! Anyways, I'll stop being a dickhead and I'll place South Africa in all right, as both the military and Air Force did a solid job at liberating. India. British Raj, Raj India, British India, call it what you want. India, like every ally in the remaining Commonwealth, had to fight off the Germans and the Italians in a tough fight. Hold on, I just called the Italians tough. What's wrong with me? In the Middle East, they took various operations against Iraq and Iran. But in the Burma campaign, Japan was intimidating, and so this wasn't going to be a piece of cake for them. Eventually, they were able to annex territory when the Japanese retreated. They occupied the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, while also winning the Battle of Kohima and the Battle of Impel. And just like every Commonwealth member, they took part in the invasion of Italy, having the better hand at the Battle of Monte Cassino. I'm struggling not to make a cringe joke about casinos and gambling. But yeah, the Indian Air Force was fantastic. They kept the Japanese at bay, and also had operations in North Africa and Europe, which both went pretty well. Considering they sent the most troops out of any other country in this war, and that Field Marshal Sir Claude Auchinleck said, unquote, Britain could not have come through both wars if they hadn't had the Indian Army, is enough for me to place them into alright. The highest rated Commonwealth in this tier list for now. Canada. Canada's contribution began when the Brits requested equipment. Only for a bit though, up until May 24, 1940, when Britain told Canada it was no longer necessary. Together with the United Kingdom, they occupied Iceland, and supplied the British for defence against the German attacks on the English Channel. On December 8, 1941, the invasion of Hong Kong happened, and Canada took part of it, though it returned with empty hands as the Japanese took charge of the colony. They cooperated in the Normandy landings, and landed successfully, along with all the other allies, with one notable exception. Between June 6th and June 11th, 1 in 7 Canadian soldiers was massacred, being given the title the Normandy Massacres. The Canadian soldiers fought to navigate themselves into the French city of Caen, and then south towards Falaise in an attempt to liberate Paris. They then linked up with the US soldiers, and so the liberation of France was almost complete. Meanwhile in Italy, the Canadians landed in Sicily, and then fought against the Italians just like their other allies. Back to France now, and the Canadians did their most major contributions in this war, the Battle of Scheldt, where the 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th Canadian Infantry Divisions came into fight. Since the Dutch royal family was transferred to Ottawa for protection, the Canadians opted to help the Dutch in their attempt of liberating themselves, in which they did successfully help the Dutch liberate themselves. Let's change the subject to Navy now. The Canadians took part in the Battle of the Atlantic, which, together with Brazil, got absolutely pounded by the German Navy. But the moral was that nobody won anything in the end. Just half of their ships missing, so I guess they're excused. Back at home, the Canadians won strategically against the Kriegsmarine in the Battle of St. Lawrence. This capped off the end of a Canadian victory. I'm still wondering though, when they fought against the Luftwaffe and killed their soldiers, were they apologizing to the dead bodies? If they did, that would be hilarious. But back on topic here. I'm placing the Canadians in alright. They're currently at the top.
Death to the traitors, death to the traitors, death to the traitors.
Australia. In my opinion, the best of them all. And of best of them all, I mean the Commonwealth. They did have a rough start though. They were threatened in the north part by the Japanese aircraft, getting bombed in Darwin. The US came to help them out and also had a few fierce naval battles with the Japanese. Despite having a good relationship, and the US also had supplies from the Australians, there was some sort of boil in the Battle of Brisbane, because Australia had a different approach to the black Americans. But then they got it together and won the Battle of Bunagona at their best attempts to kick the Japanese out of New Guinea, in which they did, capturing Wau and winning the Battle of Briggs Mark C in the southwest Pacific area. The rest of the Pacific campaign went well, liberating all of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Outside of the Pacific, and the Aussies competed in North Africa, specifically in Rommel's Operation Sunflower. They kept away the Germans for 3 months, but eventually lost on May 25th, 1941. However, the Australian 9th Division took care of the Germans, delaying their advances between the end of March and the start of April. They were on fleek, when all of a sudden they got the call from the United Kingdom to import aircraft and troops in Greece. They had sent a smaller force than the Germans, so they switched their plans to the naval force to protect Crete. In late March of 1941, the Battle of Cape Matapan occurred, with the UK and Australia successfully defending the Peloponnesian Peninsula. When Greece fell, the Australian warships began evacuation to reorganize themselves in Crete. When Crete fell as well, 3,000 Australians were taken as prisoners by the Germans. After many losses in the Greek campaign, the UAP was found illegitimate to have positive outcomes, let alone win the war. So, a new party took charge, the Australian Labour Party, with John Curtin in charge. With the brand new change, the Australian army entered Lebanon, defeated the Vichy French, and making it as far as the Litani River. After a failed operation from the Brits, which the Australians took part in, Operation Vigorous by the way, they then fought in both El Alamein battles. They provided air support in the invasion of Italy and in southern France as well. The RAAF also took part in the Battle of the Atlantic. There is a difference, and I'm talking about the Air Force name. The RAF is the Royal Air Force, which is Britain's Air Force. The RAAF is the Royal Australian Air Force, which is obviously Australia's Air Force. Understood? Okay. Further Air Force assistance would come in the early Battle of Berlin, with successful Allied bombings and in the liberation of Western Europe as well. They also took part in the landing of Normandy, though only by aircraft support. To summarise, Australia's army and navy weren't always on point, but the Air Force certainly was. It probably was just as, if not more, successful than the British Air Force. I mean, I'm not trying to be biased about Australia. As I mentioned before, they got their ass kicked by the Japanese in the early stages of the Pacific Campaign. But this was just a one-off failure. Outside of that, they were that damn good. They were better than any other Commonwealth member. But could there be an even higher rated alright country than Australia? Find out later in this video. Hungary. During the interwar, Hungary had already had tight relations with Nazi Germany and had gained Slovakian and Carpathian territory between 1938 and 1939. They then got their second Vienna Award in 1940, getting the northern part of Transylvania, with the majority of the population being Hungarian, although that was more down to the Ypres and Transair massacres, so as not to seem that both populations were pretty close to each other. After Germany coerced them to sign the Tripartite Pact on November 20th, 1940, they also requested support for the invasion of Yugoslavia. The Prime Minister at the time, Pál Teleki, was sick and tired of being flung around like some sort of peasant. He simply could not stand the pressure from Nazi Germany. The same shit that Bulgaria and Thailand had to deal with, basically. So unfortunately, Teleki took his own life into his own hands. If you know what I mean. László Bardosa took charge as Prime Minister, and the Hungarian Third Army only occupied Yugoslavia and didn't invade it. The same action that Bulgaria did, basically. They did help in the invasion of the Soviet Union, however, and won the Battle of Uman. To be honest with you, it started marvellously for the Hungarians, but after the Battle of Nikoliuka, they never won ever again. They lost the second Battle of Voronezh, despite winning the first. They got converted to a German puppet since Hitler was suspecting that their Prime Minister would make peace with the Allies. And the icing on the cake, Romania went Italy mode and decided to switch sides, now allying with the Soviet Union. On December 29th, 1944, the German and Hungarian army were being surrounded by the Soviets and Romanians, and at this point it was inevitable for Budapest to fall in Soviet hands. And eventually it did, on February 13th, 1945. The Hungarian army tried to organize themselves in mainland Germany, but they were hopelessly outmatched. Well, what can I say? It started wonderfully, and then it all started to fall apart. I guess the real turning point was the Battle of Stalingrad, but I'm still wondering what went so wrong. They get into it performed moderately. Not absolute catastrophe, because they did have a good start, remember that. But they get behind Poland, but ahead of China. Romania. Romania at first just like many countries in this war, considered themselves neutral. But then the Iron Guard took control of the country with Ion Antonescu at the helm. Certainly the last Sigma male Romanian that lived up until the birth of Gheorghe Hagi. Romania had already lost a lot of territory. The Soviets invaded and occupied Bessarabia and North Bukovina, the Treaty of Craiova handed South Dobruja to Bulgaria, and the Hungarians killed 100 Romanian Transylvanians just to claim northern Transylvania. Despite all these setbacks, they joined the Axis, but refused to attack Yugoslavia, since they had a good relationship with them. Political, not a couple relationship. They wanted their sweet revenge against the Soviets, however, and together with Germany, they advanced to Odessa, Sevastopol, and Stalingrad, reoccupying North Bukovina and Bessarabia, and also annexed Transnistria. Although, truth be told, the majority in this population was Ukrainian. The turning point came on August 1st, 1943, when the United States bombed oil factories, since Romania was providing the Germans with a shit ton of oil. On August 23rd, 1944, Michael I of Romania had a successful coup, taking control of the country, while Ion Antonescu was lined up and shot. A sad way to end his ruling of Romania. The Romanians obviously changed sides, and with the USSR won the Battle of Debrecen and the Battle of Carré. They later encircled the Germans and Hungarians, going on to take Budapest, and also won the Prague Offensive. To say that Romania didn't Italy and switched sides is justified. The Allies had forgotten about their evil side just at the moment they joined the Allies. But you can't say they did bad though, giving Germany plenty of oil resorts, having some solid victories here and there. All in all, they get into alright, ahead of New Zealand but behind South Africa. Yugoslavia. At first, Yugoslavia was about to join the Axis, but then the leader was accused of pro-fascism, and so there was a Yugoslav coup, ultimately rejecting to join the Axis. Soon after, Yugoslavia was invaded, Bulgaria was bombarded, and the country fell in a space of a week and a half. But don't you think for a moment that Yugoslavia's participation was dreadful? Far from it. During the occupation, there were plenty of uprisings from the Serb, Slovene and Vardarian partisans, and on December 22nd, 1941 became the day of the Yugoslav People's Army. In 1942, Tito's partisans marched through Bosnia, despite Bulgaria's and Croatia's best efforts to stop them. In January 1943, the Axis came to put them in their place, but also failed due to the 5th and 6th partisan offensives in Montenegro and Serbia. They tried negotiations on March 11th, 1943. After the capitulation of Italy, the Wehrmacht beat them in the operation of Google Blitz, and then a last operation named Operation Roselsprung in the spring of 1944 in Bosnia, in which they failed. After that, the partisans began to grow considerably, and following that, the Soviets came for company. Together, they won the strategical Belgrade offensive, defeated the independent state of Croatia, and kicked out the Germans. Just like Norway, we shouldn't look at Yugoslavia with rose-tinted glasses. After the fall of Yugoslavia, the partisans had fierce resistances against the Axis, and got vendetta for Croatia for Ustaše. I'm placing them in alright, ahead of both Norway and Thailand, but behind New Zealand. Greece. We've reached my home country. I'm going to try to be as unbiased as possible, but I'll probably fail because of some Portuguese caralho telling us that we asked the British for help. Spectrum, if you're watching this, which the odds are 1 million to 1, then listen carefully and take notes. As for everyone else, prepare for what I'm about to dish out here. On October 28, 1940, Mussolini sent an ultimatum to Ioannis Metaxas, telling him to join their side. Metaxas, however, said no. The same day, Italy kicked off the invasion of Greece. The Italians got off to a head start and made it as far as Igoumenitsa, but that's how far they got. The Greeks on November 14th started a counter-offensive, taking the city of Korutsa. Between November and December of 1940, the Greeks captured the city of Alonia. This was a genius move, as it only left the Italians with Durves as an entry port. The Greeks crossed the Drenos River. Despite the ridiculous cold in the mountains of Albania, they continued their advance and turned the Italians into a crisis. Hierarchical, not economical. In the new year of 1941, the Greeks captured Glycura and then won the Battle of Trebesina. By the time of February, though, the Italians retaliated against them, and so the Greeks lost Valonia. Now this is where it gets a little tricky. Greece did ask something from Britain, but not help, only aid. Britain did send aid, but only an iota. On March 4th, Britain did send support to Greece, as Winston Churchill had seen the huge potential the Greeks showed in this war. Air Force assistance came from New Zealand and Australia, while Britain sent troops. The Italians tried a spring offensive, which lasted a week, they failed to take Alisura. At that time, Greece set defences in Macedonia and Thrace in case of a German attack. On March 29th, Italian General Mario Roata asked the Germans to intervene. Because of Italian humiliation, Yugoslavia came in first, then it would be Greece. The Germans invaded Greece through Bulgaria. On April 9th, the Germans captured Thessaloniki, winning the Battle of the Metaxas Line. Xanthi and Komotini followed suit. The Battle of Vevi was won by the Germans and the 9th Panzer Division. The Greek army in Ypres also surrendered. The Battle of Thermopylos was lost, and now the Germans were one step away from Athens. The Allies withdrew from Athens to get to Crete, while on April 27th, 1941, Nazi Germany enters Athens. Crete was still free, however, and so the German soldiers departed for Crete on May 20th. The Germans had first landed at Maleme. They got treated friendly by the Cretan citizens. What do I mean by friendly? Play Cretan song in the background and I'll explain. The Cretan citizens unleashed hell on the landing German soldiers, attacking them with guns, pistols, revolvers, shotguns, axes, butcher knives, kitchen knives, and even pitchforks. Though the revolt was short-lived, as the UK did not protect the air force in Chania and Iraklio, and so Crete also fell in German hands on June 1st. It didn't end there for Greece though. The soldiers fought in Egypt and also dominated the air attacks in the British invasion of Iraq. Greece would have a go at resisting against the Nazi German power for 3 years, up until they got liberated by the British on October 12, 1944. They then had a friendly war with Bulgaria to reclaim Macedonia, in which they did. Wow. To say that Greece started wonderfully and performed poorly after the Germans came in is truly underestimating. They showed their true attitude and potential against both Germany and Italy. Winston Churchill obviously quoted that Greeks don't fight like heroes, heroes fight like Greeks. But some interesting fact that many people don't know is Hitler's quote about us. Hitler quoted, "For the sake of historical truth, I must verify that only the Greeks, of all the adversaries who confronted us, fought with bold courage and highest disregard of death." Also, Greece and Yugoslavia are the reason why Hitler delayed the invasion of the Soviet Union. Mostly Greece though. The female Suliotises helping the Greek men in the Italian war, the strategic gains, the motivation to never give up, makes me consider... Show the biased version. No, I can't show that. Show it. I'm not showing it. Come on, show it. It's too embarrassing. You'll get more views and attention if you show the biased version. But... just do it. Okay. Greece, alas, was unstoppable. The Italians, we annihilated them. We screwed them. We fucked them in the bum. Mussolini came crying like a baby to Hitler to help them. Only Germany made us fall. No one else. But even then, the Cretans showed them their true self, if you know what I mean. But nonetheless, we are the background of Allied World War II success. We delayed Operation Barbarossa. Greece is the best. Fuck you all. Fuck everybody. Now, as I was saying, the motivation to never give up makes me consider alright for Greece. Higher than Australia. Highest of them all, actually. Finland, the second most underdog performance in this war, the first being Greece. Finland's performance in World War II went jolly good. For starters, the Winter War. The Soviet Union demanded to hand over some specific territories to them. Finland refused and the Soviets invaded. The Finnish defense forces gathered themselves, but they were being pushed back to the Mannerheim line. But then, Mother Nature came to play on Finland's side. The cold weather in January 1940 went as low as minus 43 degrees Celsius, which gave the opportunity for Finland to win the Battle of fuck off! I'm not pronouncing that! Suomussalmi. There. Their guerrilla tactics paid off, as they won the Battle of the Rate Road. But while the Mannerheim Line and Karelia battles weren't going perfect, especially in Karelia due to the Soviet air superiority, Kainuu was going a lot better, and they absolutely battered the Soviets in the area of Lapland. In the end, the Soviets made peace negotiations, and that was the end for this war. In the continuation war, the Germans convinced the Finns to attack the Soviets. Risto Ryti had plans for a greater Finland anyway. In June of 1941, the Finns made significant gains. Further operations would come in July with numerous offensives and advances in Karelia. But then Britain came with Operation Silver Fox and ruined the moment. Finland was then interrupted again by Soviet partisans and then would lose the siege of Leningrad. If Helsinki wasn't bombed already once in 1941, it was definitely bombed a second time in 1944. The Finns just couldn't keep up. And in June of 1944, the Soviets won a strategic Vyborg-Petrozavodsk offensive. On September 15th, 1944, the Soviets offered the Moscow armistice. Finland had no other option but to accept the offer. Nazi Germany was pissed about this, and so they declared war, kicking off the third and final conflict for Finland, the Lapland War. The Germans may have won the Battle of Volhava, but Finland would dominate the rest of the campaign. I mean, it's Lapland. What did the Germans expect? The expectation was clear that they would get crushed. The Soviets did help a bit in the aircraft, but it's not that important. Greece may have been the shadow of Allied success in World War II, but Finland is the dark horse of World War II. The first country to be placed in very good. Japan. Before World War II even happened, they had invaded China in 1937. But this doesn't count. So let's roll straight into 1939. The Chinese may have won the first battle of Changsha, but the Japanese won the battle of South Guangxi and the battle of Saoyi, and then had to face a Chinese winter offensive with limited advance for the Chinese and did no damage to Japan. However, in 1940 Japan had some difficulties to maintain their seized territories, so the campaign reached a stalemate for now. On September 22nd, 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina. It only lasted 4 days. Japan then was told by the US to withdraw the troops from China and placed an oil embargo. Isoroku Yamamoto set the attack on Pearl Harbor with the goal of making the US incapacitate for them to continue their southeast expansion. That was the worst gamble I have ever seen. No, you don't understand. It was so bad that even Ferrari's pit stop strategies would make more sense. The US declared war, and now Japan was in an uncomfortable position. They persevered, however, and invaded and conquered at lightning fast speed. They took Guam in 2 days, British Wake Island in 2 weeks, Philippines in 5 months, Hong Kong, took British Malaya after pressuring Thailand to join them, took British Singapore capturing 80 out of the 85,000 soldiers of the UK and its Commonwealth, almost annexing the entire country of Burma, Dutch East Indies, Australia New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and then bombed Darwin and was on the brink of invading India as well. The Japanese Navy was overpowered as at the start of Japan's conquest, they beat the Americans and the Australians on a regular basis. After mid-1942, the US won decisively in the Battle of Midway. 4 Japanese ships were sunk in total, and not a humiliation for the Japanese Navy. In November 1943, Japan was still kicking China's ass, though the Chinese won the defensive Battle of Changda. In the Burma campaign, India managed to push the Japanese back. The Allies soon made numerous offensives in New Guinea and the Solomons, both of them being successful. Guam was later liberated. Japan tried a counter-offensive in China, with Operation Ichigo working out perfectly. But then the US came and they lost the Battle of West Hunan. The Burma campaign of 1944 was successful, and Mariana and Palau Islands was won by the US. In the Philippine Sea, the Japanese Navy was beaten by the US again. By the end of 1944 and the start of 1945, Japanese occupation was stopped for good, as the Philippines was liberated and the Japanese was kicked out of Burma. The Japanese this time fought with resistance against the US, losing the island of Iwo Jima but defended brutally for 5 weeks. Next up on the list was Okinawa. The Japanese launched kamikaze attacks against the US soldiers. 4,900 Americans died of the kamikaze attacks. It took 2 months, but Okinawa fell in the hands of the US. What followed after that is a national disaster. On August 6th, 1945, the US dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 70,000 to 126,000 civilians died, and 20,000 soldiers died as well. On August 9th, the same year, the second A-bomb dropped on Nagasaki. This time, 60 to 80,000 Japanese civilians were killed, with 150 plus soldiers losing their lives. In total, 129,000 to 226,000 people died to the US bombings. As a result, the US forced the Japanese to surrender on September 1st, 1945. Japan's campaign started out tremendously, but then began to go off the rails in mid-1942 and the Battle of Midway. It's unlikely that Japan could have maintained the win streak of their conquests in the Southeast Sea. But if they did, they'd get placed in superb, Instead, they get placed in very good, which is still a good position, but so much potential wasted after mid-1942. United Kingdom. By the way, I gotta address something. Both the colonies and the Commonwealth will impact the United Kingdom's performance in this list, because all of them were technically still part of the British Empire, and all of the Commonwealth countries that I mentioned before had close ties to Britain. So it counts, okay? On September 3rd, 1939, 2 days after Germany's invasion of Poland, Britain declared war to Germany, along with France. So when the Polish asked for the Allies to intervene, what did Britain do? Absolutely fuck all! The Allies now kept doing fuck all for 8 months. In other words, phony war period. Britain and France wanted to distance the action away from home as possible, so Britain mined the Norwegian coast and bombed the German Altmark ship close to the Norwegian coast. This was done because Norway rejected to stop sending Swedish iron ore to Germany. Soon after, Germany invaded both Denmark and Norway. Britain did send some troops and navy, particularly to protect the Narvik port. Eventually, Norway fell in German hands, so that contribution was a write-off. Things wouldn't improve as preparations for a German invasion on France was rather sour. The Brits only sent 200k men, whilst the French mobilized millions. The Germans later invaded Benelux, and UK and France correctly predicted a rerun of the First World War. They ran at full speed to meet the Germans near Antwerp, but with France abandoning the Ardennes, the Germans encircled the Allies, capturing the French, but the Brits escaped at Dunkirk. Britain, however, kept the motivation up and never surrendered, even with France surrendering and switching sides. After France, it was Britain's turn to defend their own country. The Battle of Britain was tense for both sides, with the German Air Force continuously bombing London and late-scale night attacks known as the Blitz. But despite that, the RAF, alongside the Australian and Canadian Air Force, defeated the Germans and defended their country. In the Battle of the Atlantic, they had a rough start against the German submarines, but with the US entering, they ended up beating them. The other naval battle, the Battle of the Mediterranean, went better, as the Brits dominated the Italians in every naval battle. In East Africa, the Italians took British Somaliland in the early stages, but Britain eventually took it back again. In North Africa this time, the Italians once again got an early head start and started invading Egypt. The Brits, however, pushed them back all the way to Libya. Erwin Rommel came for support for Italy and pushed the Brits back. Meanwhile, Winston Churchill saw the Greek advance in Albania against Fascist Italy, and after Greece was lacking supplies, Britain offered to help, though they only sent a small amount of aid. Later, they had sent some troops to fight in Greece, along with New Zealand and Australia, though Australia only sent Air Force. After Greece fell, the UK and its Commonwealth reorganised themselves in Crete, but for some reason Britain did not protect the airfields in Chania and Iraklio, and so Crete fell too. After spending a lot of time in Greece, it cost the Brits vulnerable time in Egypt, but then focused on Egypt again and won both El Alamein battles. In Southeast Asia, Japan came out of nowhere and took the British colonies, those being Wake Island, Malaya and Singapore. Singapore was the most humiliating, as 80 out of the 85,000 British soldiers were part of the casualties. British Burma was almost annexed, and now India was getting close to a Japanese invasion. In the Middle East, however, it went a lot better. Iraq, after a coup, betrayed the Brits and then they got shat on. French Syria, which was still under Vichy France's control, was invaded by both UK and Free France successfully, and Iran fell prey to the British, Australian, Soviet and Indian forces in under a week. With American entry in the war, they squeezed the Axis out of Africa and began to make some gains against the Japanese in Burma. UK's campaign from now on was only positives. They occupied Sicily and pushed into mainland South Italy, alongside their allies. Soon, one of the most sacrificial landings would occur. The landing of Normandy was the core for Allied success. The Allies successfully landed in France and pushed the Germans back. They had also helped the Soviets to deal with Finland and supported the Yugoslav partisans. The "they" refers to Britain. Duh. The Brits had also successively bombed key German cities throughout the war. Alongside the US and their Commonwealth, they pushed the Germans all the way to the West German border, ending the war in Europe, and also took back their Asian colonies when Japan was on their latter stages of this war. While Britain had some ups and downs in this war, they did mostly keep the ups and never gave up. While their Asian colonies did not help at all in their progress, their African colonies and Commonwealth Union do help them gain a position or two in this tier list. So I'll be placing the United Kingdom in very good, ahead of Japan. Nazi Germany. I'm risking this video to be striked, but oh well. Let's start from the beginning. Germany hated the Polish corridor, splitting the country into two. So at first they kindly requested for Poland to hand over the Polish corridor. When Poland rejected, Germany went nuts and invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. UK and France declared war on Germany just 2 days later, but didn't really do something to prevent them from conquering Poland. UK did nothing while France sent a small offensive in Saar, which the Germans easily defended. The Germans had also signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union, so that meant on September 17th, the Soviets joined in the invasion of Poland. The West was stunned. Germany finally conquered Poland, just short of 35 days. After that, Germany quickly noticed that the UK started a blockade to stop Norwegian and Swedish trade offers coming to Germany. The Nazis found it repellent, and so they started Operation Visa-Ubung, taking Denmark in 6 hours, and Norway in 2 months. Norway, despite being a little threat by sinking and winning naval battles in the early stages of the Norwegian campaign, the Germans took over Narvik and the Norwegians eventually surrendered. The Germans then planned to invade France, but seeing how difficult it was to invade through the Maginot Line, the Germans thought of a common tactic that was also used in World War I. The tactic in question goes by the name of "Let's go around it, lads!" And they did just that, invading Benelux, conquering them, surrounding the British and French armies after crossing through the Ardennes, invaded France, took pictures in Paris, and they were well on course for Axis domination. The UK though taunted them, saying they will never surrender, so Germany prepared for an invasion of Britain. On July 10th, 1940, German aircraft flew over British cities. Despite the bombing, or better known as Blitz, the Germans couldn't compete with the RAF, and this was one of plenty German failures in this war. Around this time, Hitler had told Mussolini that an invasion of Greece wasn't suited or worth it, so he warned him not to do it. But Mussolini did it, and when they were in deep shit, Italian officers came crying to Germany to come and intervene. Hitler was furious, as he had not only warned him that an invasion of Greece was not worth it, but also he had to delay one of his major plans of the war. So, he set his eyes on the Balkans. He had awarded Hungary a couple times, and now he pressured Paleteleki to sign the Tripartite Pact and join the Axis powers. The same thing happened to Bulgaria. Yugoslavia was more than happy to join them, but after a strange coup, they changed their mind. So Germany successively invaded Yugoslavia and then Greece, but Greece held resistances that gave Hitler quite a hard time, that he even gave a positive credit to them, which I said way back in Greece. Just skip back to listen to his quote. So finally, after helping Italy to deal with Greece and push the Brits back in Egypt in the North African campaign, Hitler could now move to one of his major plans. Operation Barbarossa was immense. It had the largest army personnel than any war in history, with 3.8 million German personnel, with 6 countries participating in it. The North Army Group had the 16th and 18th Army and also the 4th Panzer Army. The Centre Army Group had the 2nd, 4th and 9th Army and also the 2nd and 3rd Panzer Army, and the South Army Group had the 6th, 11th and 17th Army and also the 1st Panzer Army, with the Romanian 3rd and 4th Army helping out as well. From June to August of 1941, the Germans had done an excellent job, but winter came into place and Hitler had to wait for the summer to continue his advance. In June of 1942, Hitler planned to take the oil in the Caucasus. It went well, until the USSR reorganized themselves and pushed them way back. In North Africa, it wasn't going well, as Britain won both El Alamein battles, and with the US joining the war, the Axis found themselves squeezed out of Africa. After Hitler was dissatisfied with Italy's performance, the Italian people had had enough of this. And so, after the Allies took Sicily, the Italian resistance movement was formed. Hitler wasn't surprised and had sent some troops to protect fascism over there. The Allies pushed all the way up through Italy, and now the front was split into 2 parts, North and South Italy. The Nazis on the north, the US and UK on the south. The Germans then predicted an Allied liberation of France would happen, but they didn't know exactly where they would land. Alas, they landed in Normandy, and the Germans were far from ready. In August of 1944, the US and Free France landed in the South French coast. Then the Allies were attempting to liberate Benelux, but the Germans gathered their forces and trapped a couple of American troops in the Belgian city of Bastogne. Meanwhile, the Germans declared war on Finland after surrendering against the Soviets and doing negotiations instead of continuing to fight them. They fought the Finns in Lapland, which is never a good idea. They lost that war as well. Speaking of the Soviets, they pushed them away from their borders and even liberated Warsaw. The Allies now were beginning to enter the German land too, and Hitler's health was beginning to deteriorate. On April 30th, 1945, he committed suicide. 2 days before the Battle of Berlin ended, and before the Soviets raised their flag over there. Nazi Germany's campaign in particular started wonderfully and then became disastrous after mid-1942. Just like Japan's, the Battle of Stalingrad, in my opinion, was the turning point. Though Germany, like every other country, had its own fair share of failures. It wasn't necessary to declare war on the US after the Pearl Harbor attacks, though I must confess, they would be at each other's throats sooner or later. Despite Operation Barbarossa and the Caucasus invasion ending in failure, the Germans showed spirit. But for the record, I don't think they would have had a chance winning the Second World War, since they dealt with so many global superpowers, the odds of them crumbling in the end were extremely high. Because of that, and the late disasters, they'll be placed in very good, but still the highest one ranked in that tier. The United States and the Soviet Union. Yes, 2 in 1, because this is serious. These two countries have done the hardest carrying I have ever seen. Let's start with the Soviet Union. After signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, they also started invading Poland, splitting the country into two, boosting their spheres of influence. After that, it was the Winter War, which was a humiliating victory. Let me explain. Despite having the advantage in navy and aircraft, the Finns had better defense forces and so the Soviets had minimum advances. They did have a good advantage in Karelia though, but it's been estimated that during the Winter War period, over 60,000 Soviet troops suffered from frostbite. Obviously, it was minus 43 degrees. The Soviets did eventually win, thanks to the Karelian offensives and made negotiations with the Finns. But as I said before, it was a humiliating victory. On June 22nd, the Soviets were attacked by the Axis, backstabbing them, and on top of that, the Soviets were far from ready. In the summer of 1941, the Soviets were in an uncomfortable position, but then Mother Nature came for help, and so the Soviets managed to push the Germans back in the ridiculous cold. They also had the advantage, since Hitler didn't give his soldiers winter equipment, because they thought they'd be in Moscow by now. They couldn't do the same trick against Finland, losing the region of Karelia, before the UK came in for support, launching Operation Silver Fox, which was an Allied victory. Over to the US for a moment, and when the US decided to form an oil embargo on Japan after continuing to invade China, the Japanese responded by a gentle attack on Pearl Harbor. The US was furious and declared war on Japan. Japan's lightning-fast speed conquests had the US with a lot of work to do. The US lost all their Asian colonies to Japan, those being Guam, Gilbert Islands, and the Philippines, and had some struggles to deal with the Japanese Navy, most notably the Battle of the Coral Sea. It's the new year of 1942, and the Soviet Union are still in an awful position. The Germans had a new plan, to invade the Caucasus and take all the oil. In this other invasion, the Soviets fought both the most famous and the most sacrificial battle I have ever seen. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted 5 months, before the Soviets eventually won it. Then came the US Lend-Lease, which will trigger most of your bias right now. I can already witness the arguments in my head that if the US did not send tanks and machines, the Soviets would be conquered. Whatever the US had sent, those tanks can't drive themselves. In the Battle of Kursk, after bossing the Germans in the south with Operation Rumyantsev, the Germans retreated to South Ukraine. The United States, meanwhile, beat the Japanese dominantly in the Battle of Midway, sinking 4 Japanese ships. They had also helped Australia to take New Guinea with anti-aircraft support. They also began to help China and Burma. In North Africa, they helped Britain to kick the Axis out of Africa. In Europe, the US launched fire to defeat the Italian soldiers in Sicily. Then in mainland Italy, raiding loads of cities. Mussolini's regime collapsed and now Italy was split between Axis and Allies. Meanwhile, the US liberated the Gilbert Islands. It took 2 years, but after some aircraft bombing over Japanese ships, Gilbert Islands was theirs again. The USSR, on the other hand, had won the Crimean offensive and was now into mainland Romania. In June of 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy, successfully capturing the beaches. The US, after capturing Omaha Beach, they then liberated Brittany. In August, alongside Free France, they easily marched through South France. The Soviets, after the Romanians formed a coup and joined their side, conquered Bulgaria and turned them communist, liberated Budapest and then later Belgrade, and had also won the siege of Leningrad and the Vyborg-Petrozavodsk offensive, ending the continuation war. The US helped Belgium for liberation, in the most famous battle for them, the Battle of the Bulge. By the end of 1944, both the US and USSR were just outside Nazi Germany's borders, and you know what? I can't be arsed bragging about how good the US and USSR were in this war. Instead, I'm going to show you a small footage and edit of what they did between the end of 1944 and 1945. So, enjoy. So yeah, my congratulations to the American eagle who doesn't know what a kilometer is and thinks that the entire African continent is one country. And my other congratulations to the Russian bear who drinks 20 vodkas a day and plays Counter-Strike for a living. Well done, gentlemen. You both go into superb. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. I know I didn't reach the 20 to 30 minute limit video that I wanted, but it happens, okay? Anyways, if you made it this far, tell me in the comments if you agree or disagree with most of my choices in this WW2 tier list. And as always, feel free to like and subscribe. Only if you want to though, no pressure. But yeah, I gotta wrap things up because this video has been going on forever. So yeah, I'll see you guys next time.